We'll record, and let's open to Acts chapter 2. And so again, we're still talking about the day of the Lord, and we looked at a few passages in the Old Testament, and then we went through a little bit of Joel chapter 1 and then through Joel chapter 2 in more detail, because that has a lot of information about the day of the Lord. And then when we come to the end of Joel chapter 2, that's where Peter quotes from in Acts chapter 2. And so that's what we've been looking at. So in Acts chapter 2, and I'll start again in verse 16. But this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel, and it shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out of my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And on my servants and on my handmaidens I will pour out in those days of my spirit, and they shall prophesy. Okay, so we've talked about in some detail about verses 17 and 18. And then verse 19, and I will show wonders in heaven above. And we also talked about that in some detail last week. And then verse 19 continues, and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. So that's where I want to pick it up today, is in the middle of verse 19, and talk about the signs in the earth beneath. And so, as I mentioned briefly, as we were concluding last week, there are some who try to say that these signs in verse 19 are speaking in tongues and healing and so forth, but clearly that's not the case. And one reason we know that's not the case is because it tells us in verse 19 what these wonders and signs are. And so it says blood and fire and vapor of smoke. So those are the signs that are mentioned in verse 19. And so again, all of these wonders and signs will take place in the last days. None of them took place in Acts chapter 2 or anywhere in the book of Acts, and haven't yet, but they will all be in the last days. And so again, none of this in verse 17, 18, and now verse 19, none of this was fulfilled in Acts 2 or anywhere in the book of Acts, not even in type. There's some who say that they were fulfilled in type here in Acts chapter 2, and then the complete ultimate fulfillment will be later, but they were not fulfilled even in type at this time. And so in verse 19, I want to look at these signs. So again, it's blood and fire and vapor of smoke. So first, what signs are spoken of here when he talks about blood? And so turn to Ezekiel chapter 38. And without a lot of comment, we'll just look at a few passages or verses that are set in the last days and talk about blood. And so Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 22. And I will plead against him with pestilence and with blood, and I will rain upon him and upon his bands and upon the many people that are with him, and overflowing rain and great hailstones, fire and brimstone. So you see a number of signs mentioned in this verse, but one of them it says, and I will plead against him with pestilence and with blood. And then, so that was verse 22. Then in Ezekiel 38, again, Jean Grosser, do you read verse 18?
38, 18. Oh, I was in the wrong chapter, 38, 18. And it shall come to pass at the same time when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face.
Okay, so this verse, just real quickly, gives us the context here. So it's in the context of judgment upon Gog for coming against Israel. And this again will be in the last days. Then turn to the book of Revelation, chapter 8. Revelation chapter 8, and Dennis, would you read verses 7 and 8?
Revelation 8, 7 and 8. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. And the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood.
Okay, so here again, we're focusing on the word blood at the moment. And so it says, the first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood. And then again at the end of verse 8, and the third part of the sea became blood. So again, and the setting here is again in the last days. Then Revelation chapter 11. And Revelation chapter 11 talks about these two witnesses. And I believe it's Moses and Elijah, that they will come back. And so in Revelation chapter 11, Sharon, would you read verse 6?
Verse 6. These have power to shut heaven, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues as often as they will.
Okay, so when Moses and Elijah return, as it says in verse 6, they have power over waters to turn them to blood. And again, that will be in the last days. And then Revelation chapter 16. Revelation chapter 16, and would Dan or Laura read verse 3?
And the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and it became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea.
Okay, so the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and it became as the blood of a dead man. And then again in Revelation chapter 16, Dick, would you read verse 4?
Okay, 16 verse 4. And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood.
Okay, so the rivers and fountains of waters became blood. And then again, in the same chapter, Dan and Lisa, would you read verses 5 and 6? So Revelation chapter 16, verses 5 and 6.
And I heard the angel of the waters say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art, and wast, and shall be, because thou hast judged thus. For they have shed the blood of the saints and the prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy.
Okay, so in verse 5, notice it's the angel of the waters. And the angel says, for they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink. So you can turn back again to Acts chapter 2. And so you can see a number of verses that talk about signs of blood in the last days. Okay, and then in Revelation chapter 2, again, and verse 19.
Revelation.
Sorry, the book of Acts chapter 2 and verse 19. So, excuse me, after blood, it says, and fire. So another of the signs in the last days will be fire. And this fire is spoken of in many passages. Go back again to the book of Revelation, chapter 8. Revelation chapter 8, and beginning again in verse 5. And the angel took the censer and filled it with fire. So now we're focusing on the word fire. Filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. And there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. And the seven angels which had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound. And so again, you see here the mention of fire. And then again in Revelation chapter 8, would Tim or Jean read verse 7?
I'm sorry, what was the verse?
Revelation chapter 8 and verse 7.
7. Okay. 8:7. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. And the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up.
Okay, so we read this verse earlier, focusing on the blood, but now notice, and there followed hail and fire. And then again in Revelation chapter 8, Dominic, would you read verse 8?
Angel sounded, and as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood.
Okay, so again, we saw earlier the blood in this verse, but it says speaks in verse 8 about a great mountain burning with fire. Okay, then Revelation chapter 9, and Gabrielle, would you read verses 17 and 18? Revelation 9, verses 17 and 18.
Revelation 9:17 and 18. And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire, and of jacinth and brimstone. And the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issues fire and smoke and brimstone. By these three was the third part of men killed, by the fire, and by the smoke, and by the brimstone, which issued out of their mouths.
Okay, so those sitting upon the horses are having breastplates of fire. And then also regarding the horses, it says, out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. And then again, Revelation chapter 11, and these two witnesses. In Revelation chapter 11, would Bonsinger Joyce read verse 5?
And if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devoureth the enemy. And if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed.
So again, regarding the ministry of these two witnesses, it says fire proceedeth out of their mouth. And then chapter 16 in Revelation chapter 16, and Akun, would you read verse 8?
And the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire.
Okay, so regarding the fourth angel, it says power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. And then chapter 18 in Revelation chapter 18, and Pakinatan, would you read verse 8?
Therefore shall her plagues come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she shall be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judgeth her.
Okay, so this is in the context of the judgment that will come upon Babylon, and it says she shall be utterly burned with fire. And so you can see there are, again, a number of passages talking about about the signs of fire in the last days. And then again, go back to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, and again in verse 19. And so it speaks about wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath. And then it specifically mentions blood, which we've looked at and fire, which we've looked at. And then the other wonder sign here is vapor of smoke. Okay, so let's again go back to the book of Revelation and chapter 9. Revelation chapter 9 and verse 2. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. So this verse talks about a smoke that arises out of the pit. And so we're focusing now on the vapor of smoke, or the word smoke in particular. Okay, then again in Revelation chapter 9, Jean Gross, would you read verse 3?
Okay, Revelation 9:3. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power.
So there came out of the smoke locusts. And then later in Revelation chapter 9, Dennis, would you read verse 17? Revelation chapter 9, verse 17.
And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire, and of jacinth, and brimstone, and the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone.
Okay, so regarding these horses, out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. And then Revelation chapter 9, and Sharon, would you read verse 18?
9:18. By these three was the third part of men killed, by the fire, and by the smoke, and by the brimstone, which issued out of their mouths.
And so you have mention here of men killed by the fire and by the smoke and by the brimstone. And then earlier we looked at a verse about the judgment that will come upon Babylon. Turn to chapter 18 in Revelation. And so we saw the fire associated with this judgment. So Revelation chapter 18, and would Dan or Laura read verse 9?
Reward her, even as she rewarded you, and doubled unto her double according to her.
Sorry, chapter 18 and verse 9.
Revelation 18:9. I'm so sorry. And the kings of the earth, who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her, shall bewail her and lament her when they shall see the smoke of her burning.
Okay, so they will see, again, this is regarding the judgment upon Babylon, and the kings of the earth bewail her, Babylon, when they shall see the smoke of her burning. And then again, in Revelation chapter 18, Dick, would you read verses 17 and 18? So Revelation chapter 18 and verses 17 and 18.
Okay, verses 17 and 18. For in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught, and every shipmaster, and all the company in ships, and sailors, and as many as trade by sea stood afar off, and cried when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like unto this great city?
Okay, and so when they see Babylon being destroyed, it says they cried when they saw the smoke of her burning. And then one more in Revelation chapter 19. Revelation chapter 19, and would Tim or Jean read verse 3?
Revelation 19:3. And again they said, Hallelujah, and her smoke rose up forever and ever.
So her smoke rose up forever and ever. Okay, then let's go back to Acts chapter 2. And so all of these passages that we've read today, all of them are in the context of the last days. And you can see when you look again at Acts chapter 2 and verse 19, you can see there are many passages about these wonders and signs of blood and fire and vapor of smoke. Okay, then Acts chapter 2 and verse 20. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before that great and notable day of the Lord come. And so in Acts chapter 2 and verse 20, Peter is continuing to quote from Joel chapter 2. So let's we'll come back to Acts, but let's just flip over to Joel for a moment and read the verse in Joel that Peter's quoting. So Joel chapter 2, and the verse he's quoting in this case is verse 31. So Joel chapter 2, verse 31. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and the terrible day of the Lord come. And so they're almost the same, just a little difference. If you compare Joel chapter 2, verse 31 with Peter's quotation of it in Acts chapter 2 and verse 20. So Joel has the word terrible, terrible day, and Peter changes that to notable, the notable day. So the word terrible means frightful, adapted to excite terror, dreadful. And the word notable means remarkable, worthy of notice, memorable, observable. So when reading passages about the day of the Lord, which we've read several today and in the previous weeks, it's certainly true that the day of the Lord is both terrible and it's notable. So it's remarkable in being so frightful, and so it's terrible. But it's also very much worthy of notice because it is adapted to excite terror. And so it's very much notable. So there's no problem or issue at all with that change of wording there by Peter. It just adds a little bit more information about that day. Okay, then back in Acts chapter 2. And so in Acts chapter 2 and verse 19, we read that God will show wonders in heaven above. And then we read several passages about those wonders last week. Now in verse 20, it says that it tells us specifically what some of these wonders are. And so first in verse 20, it says, the sun shall be turned into darkness. And we've noted several passages about that already when we were talking about verse 18, I guess. Or verse 19, I'm sorry, the wonders in heaven above. But turn to Matthew chapter 24 again. Matthew chapter 24. And again, we'll just look at a few verses quickly regarding this, shall the sun be darkened? And again, without a lot of comment, and just quickly notice some verses. So first of all, Matthew chapter 24, and Dominic, would you read verse 29, Matthew 24:29?
Matthew 24:29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken.
Okay, so shall the sun be darkened? And then go again to the book of Revelation, chapter 6, and that the verse Dominic just read in Matthew 24 clearly tells us the timing of that. It says immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened. Okay, then Revelation chapter 6. And Gabrielle, would you read verse 12?
Revelation 6:12. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood.
Okay, so the sun became black as sackcloth of hair. And then chapter 8 in Revelation. And would Bonsinger Joyce read verse 12?
And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise.
Okay, so in verse 12, the third part of the sun was smitten. And in the verse, it defines that as being darkened. And then chapter 9 in Revelation. And Akun, would you read verse 2?
And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by the reason of the smoke of the pit.
Okay, so the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And then chapter 16 in Revelation. And Pakinatan, would you read verse 10, chapter 16, verse 10?
And the fifth angel poured out his oil upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain.
Okay, so his kingdom was full of darkness, and that's referring to the kingdom of the beast. By the way, I hope Pakinatan won't mind me mentioning that he just arrived in America to visit his daughter and son-in-law. They had a baby recently, and so he's Pakinatan and his wife are seeing the baby for the first time. Okay, back to Acts chapter 2. So they literally just arrived a few hours ago. Okay, Acts chapter 2 again, and verse 20 says, the sun shall be turned into darkness. And we just looked at several passages talking about that. Again, all of them, again, set in the last days. And then verse 20 continues, and the moon into blood. And so that will be, so in verse 20, the sun shall be turned into darkness, and then the moon shall be turned into blood. And the same verses that we just read about the sun being darkened also speak about the moon. So we won't turn back and reread all these verses, but Matthew chapter 24 and verse 29 says the moon shall not give her light. Revelation chapter 6 and verse 12 says the moon became as blood. Revelation chapter 8 and verse 12 says the third part of the moon was darkened. And then again, Revelation chapter 16 and verse 10, which we just read, says his kingdom was full of darkness. And that would be in the daytime because the sun is darkened, but it would also be at night. The moon will not be giving its light. Okay, then in Acts chapter 2 and verse 20, it continues. It says, before that great and notable day of the Lord come. And so the day of the Lord refers to the second coming of Christ. It does not include the 70th week. There are many who teach that it does. But when we began to talk about the day of the Lord, we looked in Isaiah chapter 2, where it clearly says, speaking of the day of the Lord, and it says, in that day the Lord alone will be exalted. And you certainly cannot say during the 70th week that the Lord alone is exalted, because that's when the Antichrist will be exalted. The beast will be worshiped. So the day of the Lord does not include the 70th week, but again, it's referring to the second coming. And so notice in verse 20, again, the end of verse 20, it says, before that great and notable day of the Lord come. And it's I think at least somewhat interesting and significant that the scriptures never speak of the day of the Lord beginning. So we often ask the question and discuss the question, when does the day of the Lord begin? But the scriptures never use that language. Now, obviously, it hasn't happened yet, and it's not happening now. So there has to be a time when it will begin. So I'm not suggesting that it doesn't begin. But the scriptures always speak of the day of the Lord coming rather than beginning. So again, in verse 20, before that great and notable day of the Lord come. And that's not only in this verse, but that's always the language that the scriptures use. It talks again about the day of the Lord coming. And the idea is it will come to the earth. And so there are many passages that make it clear that the day of the Lord, or the second coming, will be great and terrible and notable, as stated here in verse 20 and also in Joel 2. And also I'll mention that there's some who have tried to make a distinction between the day of the Lord and then here in verse 20, the great and notable day of the Lord. But there's no such distinction made in scriptures when you compare the verses. So that's an artificial distinction. Okay, then turn back again to Matthew chapter 24. So the day of the Lord again is great, it's terrible, it's notable, and other things that are said about that day. But they're not two different day of the Lord's or days of the Lord. Okay, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 29 once again. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And so we read again clearly in this verse that these wonders and signs that we've been talking about in Acts 2 take place immediately after the tribulation of those days. And we don't have to wonder, well, what tribulation is it speaking about here? Because if you just go a bit earlier in Matthew chapter 24, Jean Gross, would you read verse 21?
Matthew 24:21.
Yep.
For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be.
So when verse 29 says immediately after the tribulation of those days, it's clearly talking about the tribulation in verse 21. Then shall be great tribulation. And this is referring to the last 3.5 years of the 70th week of Daniel. And so this time in verse 21, where it says, for then shall be great tribulation, the word then refers back to verse 15. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation. So that marks the middle of the 70th week, the middle of the 7 years. And that's when the great tribulation in verse 21 begins. And then again, verse 29 is set after the tribulation of those days. turn to Mark chapter 13. Mark chapter 13, and Dennis, would you read verse 24? Mark 13:24.
Mark 13:24. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light.
So again, here the timing is very clear, but in those days after that tribulation. Now, unlike what we just saw in Matthew 24, the word tribulation is not found anywhere else in Mark chapter 13. So we don't find that exact word to connect with verse 24 after that tribulation. But clearly, as you're reading through the chapter, and we won't read all these verses, but if you read verses 14 to 23 in Mark 13, clearly those verses are describing the tribulation that he speaks of in verse 24. And so, again, this is all in the second half of the 70th week. And so the wonders and the signs in heaven, spoken of in Acts 2 and Joel 2, take place again after the tribulation of those days, after the last 3.5 years of the 70th week. But then if you again turn back to Acts chapter 2, and in verse 19 and 20, it speaks of these wonders and signs. But at the end of verse 20, it says, before that great and notable day of the Lord come. So if you compare Matthew 24:29, which we read a couple times today, with Acts chapter 2 and verse 20, one says that these wonders and signs will take place immediately after the tribulation of those days in Matthew 24. And then here it says they will take place before that great and notable day of the Lord come. So again, the tribulation of those days is the last 3.5 years of the 70th week. The day of the Lord here is the second coming of Christ. So that means these signs and wonders that we've been reading about today and last week will take place immediately after the 70th week, but before the second coming of Christ. And so this is something that I find is not reflected, for example, in charts that I've seen, or oftentimes in teaching about the last days. But when you compare the Matthew 24:29 with Acts 2:20, that seems to me crystal clear that there is a time that is after the 70th week, but it's before the second coming of Christ. So usually charts and the common teaching is that as soon as the 70th week ends, Christ comes. Or in fact, Christ's coming is what brings the 70th week to its conclusion. But I think that's not true. Because again, comparing these two verses, there are some things that take place in between those two things, in between the 70th week and the second coming of Christ. Okay, let's turn back to Isaiah chapter 2. And when we began to talk about the day of the Lord, we looked at this passage, but now having looked at a number of things and seen specifically the timing of these things, I want to just revisit this again briefly. So Isaiah chapter 2, and Sharon, would you read verse 10?
Isaiah 2:10. Enter
Yes.
into the rock and hide thee in the dust for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty.
So enter into the rock and hide thee in the dust for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty. Okay, keep Isaiah open. We're going to come right back, but turn over to Revelation chapter 6. So are there other passages where it talks about them hiding for fear of the Lord? And in fact, there are. And one of them is in Revelation chapter 6. And would Dan or Laura read verses 15 and 16? Revelation chapter 6, verse 15 and 16.
And then the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb.
Okay, so clearly this is describing the same thing that we just read briefly about in Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 10, where they, the end of verse 15, they hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains. And in verse 16, they're hiding from the face of him that sitteth on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. And then in Revelation chapter 6 again, back up a little. So we just read verses 15 and 16. Back up a little bit in Revelation chapter 6 to verse 12. So verse 12, and I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And so the hiding in verses 15 and 16 appears to be simultaneous with these signs and wonders that are mentioned here in verses 12 through 14, and that we've read several passages about today. This is when they will hide themselves, when these signs and wonders take place. And so again, this is not during the 70th week when they're hiding themselves. It's immediately after the tribulation of those days. And it signifies, if you look at the verse 17, Revelation 6, verse 17, it signifies, for the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? Okay, and then again, a number of things that we've been reading about take place. And so Revelation, the chapters we've been reading today in Revelation and the events we've been reading about, they take place after the 70th week, but before the second coming of Christ, which is in Revelation chapter 19. All right, let's go back to Isaiah chapter 2. And so a moment ago, Sharon read verse 10, where again, they're hiding for fear of the Lord. Then Isaiah chapter 2, and Dick, would you read the next verse, verse 11?
Okay, Isaiah 2, verse 11. The lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day.
Okay, so the lofty looks of man shall be humbled. And so when will that be? Certainly, if you're speaking in general terms, the lofty looks of men have certainly not yet been humbled in human history, and they're certainly not today. So when will that be? And then verse 11 says, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. So that day in verse 11 refers to the second coming of Christ, because it cannot be said that the lofty looks of man are humbled or that the Lord alone is exalted until the second coming of Christ. It certainly, again, will not take place during the 70th week. And so the Antichrist and his followers will be very proud and exalted during the 70th week. Okay, then again, Isaiah chapter 2, and would Tim or Jean read verse 12?
Isaiah 2, verse 12. For the day of the Lord of hosts shall be upon everyone who is proud and lofty, and upon everyone who is lifted up, and he shall be brought low.
And so again, similar to the comments I made about verse 11. And so the day of the Lord in verse 12, again, is the second coming of Christ. And that's when the Lord of hosts shall be upon everyone that is proud and lofty, and he shall be brought low. And then again in Isaiah chapter 2, and Dominic, would you read verse 17? Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 17.
And the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of man shall be made low, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day.
Okay, and so notice at the end of verse 17, in that day, and that's the day of the Lord, second coming of Christ, that's when the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. And then Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 19. And they shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. In that day a man shall cast his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made, each one for himself, to worship to the moles and to the bats, to go into the clefts of the rocks and into the tops of the ragged rocks, for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. So this gives further description about when they will go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth for fear of the Lord. And this will take place, it says, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. And so the day of the Lord refers again to the second coming. So it's again after the tribulation of those days. And again, it talks about the day of the Lord coming in scriptures, but it begins when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth, as is mentioned here. All right, so we will stop there for today. Thank you all very much again. But as we look at Acts chapter 2, verse 17, 18, 19, and now 20, none of this was fulfilled in Acts chapter 2 or in the book of Acts. It's all remaining to be fulfilled in the last days. All right, thank you.